The Grand Council chamber stretched across 500 meters of polished obsidian, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows that even dragon eyes could barely pierce. Queen Vex'ahlia Sunscorch sat upon her throne of crystallized starfire, her massive form radiating heat that made the air shimmer. Her scales gleamed like molten platinum, each one larger than a human shield, and her wings lay folded against her back like collapsed solar sails. She was ancient, powerful, and absolutely certain of her superiority. The lesser dragons arranged themselves in descending order of rank, their colors ranging from deep crimson to cold silver. They had gathered to discuss what many called the human problem, though Vex'ahlia preferred to think of it as a minor irritation. Humans had been spreading through the galaxy for barely 3 centuries, yet somehow they appeared everywhere, like persistent vermin. Lord Cremaxis, a red dragon of considerable age, spoke first. His voice rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder. He described the latest reports from the outer territories. Human colony ships had been spotted in 17 new systems. They built their settlements on worlds that proper species would never consider habitable. Planets with toxic atmospheres, extreme gravity, or deadly radiation. Somehow these fragile creatures adapted and survived. Vex'ahlia listened with growing annoyance. Dragons had ruled the stars for 50,000 years. They had conquered hundreds of worlds through superior strength, advanced technology, and the simple fact that few species could stand against a being that could breathe plasma hot enough to melt steel. Humans possessed none of these advantages, yet they persisted. A younger dragon named Silthrix stepped forward. She was barely 3,000 years old, which made her practically a hatchling in dragon terms. Her silver scales caught the light as she bowed respectfully before speaking. She proposed something that made several dragons hiss in shock. The Imperium should study human genetics more closely, perhaps even consider selective breeding programs to understand their remarkable adaptability. Dragon bloodlines had remained pure for millennia, but some whispered that this purity had led to stagnation. The chamber erupted into chaos. Roars of outrage echoed off the walls. Several dragons released jets of flame in their fury, scorching the ancient stone. Vex'ahlia rose from her throne, and the very movement silenced the room. She was twice the size of any other dragon present, and her anger was a physical force that pressed down on everyone. She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was cruel and mocking. The idea that dragons would breed with humans was the most disgusting thing she had ever heard. Humans were insects, barely worth noticing. They lived for perhaps a century if they were lucky. They had soft skin that tore easily, weak bones that broke under pressure, and they could not even survive in space without their pathetic machines. Dragons were perfect, the apex of evolution, beings of power and majesty. To suggest mixing dragon blood with human weakness was an insult to everything their civilization represented. Vex'ahlia turned her burning gaze on Silthrix. She asked if the young dragon had lost her mind. Perhaps she had spent too much time studying lesser species and had forgotten what she was. The humiliation was complete and public. Silthrix fled the chamber in shame, and no other dragon dared to speak in her defense. The matter was settled. There would be no contact with humans beyond what was necessary to keep them from interfering with dragon interests. 3 weeks later, Vex'ahlia received reports of human colony ships pushing into the verdant expanse, a resource-rich sector that the Imperium had claimed generations ago. This was beyond tolerating. She would handle this matter personally and remind the humans of their place in the universal order. She took her flagship, the Eternal Dominion, along with a battle fleet of 30 warships. The human colony convoy consisted of 5 transport vessels and 2 escort frigates. It should have been a simple matter of destroying the escorts and forcing the transports to turn back. Vex'ahlia expected the entire engagement to last less than an hour. The battle began as planned. Dragon plasma cannons tore through the first escort frigate's shields within seconds. The second frigate attempted evasive maneuvers, but it was like watching a turtle try to outrun a hawk. Vex'ahlia watched from the bridge of her flagship with satisfaction. Humans would learn that there were borders they could not cross. Then something unexpected happened. The damaged frigate, its hull breaching and fires spreading through multiple decks, suddenly changed course. Instead of trying to escape or making a final desperate attack run, it aimed directly for the Eternal Dominion. The human captain pushed his engines past safety limits, accelerating straight toward the Dragon flagship. Vex'ahlia ordered evasive action, but the frigate was moving too fast and too erratically. The human ship's captain executed a series of maneuvers that made no tactical sense, jerking the vessel in random directions that made targeting impossible. At the last second, he angled his ship toward the Eternal Dominion's starboard power core. The collision was catastrophic. The frigate's reactor went critical on impact, creating an explosion that tore through the flagship's shields like paper. Vex'ahlia felt the deck buckle beneath her claws. Warning alarms screamed through the bridge as systems failed across the ship. She roared orders, but it was too late. The power core was breaching. She had only seconds to make a decision. Her draconic pride warred with her survival instinct. Finally, instinct won. She crashed through the bridge viewport and spread her wings, catching the solar wind as her flagship began to tear itself apart behind her. Escape pods launched in all directions, carrying her crew to safety. But the exploding power core released an electromagnetic pulse that fried most nearby systems. Vex'ahlia felt her personal shield generator fail. Debris from the dying ship struck her left wing, tearing through the membrane. She tried to maintain flight, but without her shield and with a damaged wing, she was vulnerable to the physics of space combat in ways she had never experienced before. A piece of hull plating, still glowing from heat, tumbled through space and struck her across the head. The impact would not have killed her, but it stunned her long enough that she lost control. She began falling toward the nearby planet, a frozen world that had been marked on charts as uninhabitable and worthless. As she plummeted through the atmosphere, her consciousness fading in and out, she saw another object falling near her. It was an escape pod, small and insignificant, bearing human identification markers. She had no way of knowing that it carried Commander Marcus Chen, the frigate captain who had just destroyed her flagship. He had stayed at his post until the last possible moment, ensuring his ramming trajectory was perfect before finally evacuating. Both of them fell toward the ice planet below. Both of them crashed in the frozen wastes, separated by only a few kilometers, and both of them were about to learn that survival changes everything, even beliefs that seem absolutely certain. Vex'ahlia had ridiculed the idea that humans could offer anything of value to dragons. She was about to discover just how wrong she had been. Vex'ahlia woke to pain that she had not felt in 1,000 years. Her left wing was broken, the membrane torn and useless. Burns covered sections of her scales where plasma had leaked through her failing shields. Worst of all, she was cold. Dragons were creatures of fire and heat, and this planet's temperature was far below what she could comfortably tolerate in her injured state. She had crashed into a canyon of blue ice that stretched in both directions further than even her enhanced vision could see. The sky above was a pale gray, and wind howled through the canyon with a sound like screaming. She tried to take flight but immediately collapsed as her damaged wing refused to support her weight. For the first time in millennia, Queen Vex'ahlia Sunscorch was trapped on the ground. Her communicator was destroyed. Her personal shield generator was slag. She had nothing but her natural abilities, and half of those were compromised by her injuries. She needed shelter, she needed time to heal, and she needed it before nightfall when the temperature would drop even further. Marcus Chen climbed out of his escape pod and immediately understood that he was in serious trouble. The pod's computer informed him that the outside temperature was -50 degrees and dropping. His survival suit would keep him alive for perhaps 6 hours before its heating elements failed. After that, he would freeze to death. He gathered what supplies he could from the pod: an emergency kit with basic tools, a week's worth of ration bars, a thermal blanket, and a plasma cutter with enough charge for maybe 30 minutes of use. Not enough to survive, but humans had a saying about working with what you had. He climbed to the top of a nearby ice ridge to assess his situation. That was when he saw her. Even from a kilometer away, the dragon was unmistakable. She was the largest living thing he had ever seen, and he recognized her coloring from intelligence reports. Queen Vex'ahlia herself, the ruler of the Draconic Imperium, was stranded on the same frozen wasteland as him. Marcus understood tactics and strategy. He had just destroyed her flagship and killed who knows how many of her crew. If she found him, she would kill him without hesitation. The smart move was to hide, to hope they were rescued separately. But as he watched, he saw her try to fly and fail. She was injured, possibly badly, and the temperature was dropping fast. He made a decision that defied all logic. He walked toward her. Vex'ahlia saw the human approaching and felt rage override her pain. This insignificant creature was responsible for her current situation. She would burn him to ash and eat his remains. She opened her jaws and summoned her plasma breath. But what emerged was barely a flicker of flame. Her internal furnace was too cold, her body too damaged. She could not even kill a single human. Marcus stopped at what he hoped was a safe distance and raised his hands to show he was unarmed. He spoke in clear Draconic, which surprised her. He said they both knew the situation. Neither of them would survive alone. The planet would kill them in different ways, but with equal certainty. He proposed a truce until rescue arrived. Vex'ahlia wanted to refuse out of pure pride. But she was a queen, and queens had to make hard choices. She agreed, but warned him that the moment they were rescued, she would personally execute him. Marcus nodded and said he expected nothing less. Then he asked if she could still produce flame at all, even a small amount. She managed a weak jet of fire, barely hot enough to melt ice. Marcus used his plasma cutter to slice chunks from the canyon wall and had her heat them into a crude shelter. He worked for 3 hours straight, his hands growing numb despite his gloves, building a cave of fused ice that would block the wind. Vex'ahlia watched with growing confusion. She had always been taught that humans were weak, yet this one worked through conditions that should have killed him. That first night, the temperature dropped to -90 degrees. Marcus huddled in his thermal blanket against the back wall of their shelter. Even with Vex'ahlia's body heat radiating through the small space, he shivered uncontrollably. She could hear his teeth chattering, a sound that annoyed her immensely. She told him to be quiet or she would eat him to solve both their problems. He laughed, which shocked her. He said that at least he would die warm. The days that followed established a routine. Marcus would venture out to search for food and water, while Vex'ahlia rested and tried to heal. He found a species of ice-dwelling creature that resembled a cross between a seal and an insect. They were aggressive and dangerous, but Marcus set traps using debris from his escape pod. When he dragged the first kill back to their shelter, Vex'ahlia was surprised. The creature was twice his size and should have killed him easily. She asked how he defeated it. Marcus showed her the trap mechanism he had built, a simple system of weights and sharpened metal that used the creature's own aggression against it. She had never seen anything like it. Dragons hunted through superior strength and power. This was different. This was using intelligence to overcome physical disadvantage. As weeks passed, Vex'ahlia began to notice other things. Marcus constantly modified their shelter, improving it in small ways that made their survival more likely. He created a water collection system that caught moisture from the air. He mapped the surrounding territory and identified which areas were safest. When he broke his arm falling through thin ice, he set it himself with a makeshift splint and continued working. She found herself talking to him during the long nights when the wind howled outside. She learned that humans lived such short lives that they had to accomplish everything quickly. They could not waste centuries contemplating decisions. They had to act, fail, learn, and try again. Their entire civilization was built on the concept of rapid iteration. Marcus asked her about dragon culture. She described the grand libraries that held knowledge from 100,000 years of civilization. The art galleries displaying masterpieces created over centuries. The meditation chambers where dragons contemplated philosophy for decades at a time. She spoke with pride, but as she talked, she began to hear it differently. Everything she described was about preservation, about maintaining what had already been achieved. When was the last time dragons had created something truly new? 2 months into their stranding, a massive storm rolled across the ice planet. The winds reached speeds that tore through their shelter like it was nothing. Marcus's survival suit finally gave out, its power cell depleted beyond recovery. The temperature inside their collapsed shelter dropped below -100 degrees. Vex'ahlia watched as Marcus's skin turned blue, and his movements became sluggish. Hypothermia was killing him. She had a choice to make. She could let him die, removing a potential threat and eliminating the strange confusion he caused in her thoughts. Or she could save him. She curled her massive body around him, enveloping him completely in her wings and tail. Her scales conducted heat from her internal furnace directly to his frozen body. It was intimate in a way that dragons never experienced with other species. She could feel his heartbeat against her scales, fast and weak. She could feel his breath against her chest, shallow and desperate. She held him like that for 3 days while the storm raged. They talked in the darkness, sharing stories of their lives. Marcus told her about human art and music, concepts that changed constantly across generations. He described love, not as a weakness but as a strength that motivated humans to protect each other. Vex'ahlia found herself describing her loneliness. something she had never admitted to anyone. Immortality meant watching everything change except yourself. When the storm finally passed and Marcus had recovered enough to move, something had changed between them. Vex'ahlia could no longer see him as just a human. He had a name, a history, thoughts and feelings that mattered, and he looked at her not with fear or worship, but with something she could not quite identify. The rescue ships arrived 3 months after the crash. Dragon search parties had finally located their queen's distress beacon. As the ships descended, Vex'ahlia and Marcus stood together at the mouth of their shelter looking up at Salvation. She told him that she would keep her word. Once they returned, she would have to treat him as a prisoner. He understood and said he expected nothing different. But as they waited to be retrieved, Vex'ahlia realized that she was not ready to say goodbye. More troubling, she was not sure she could execute him as she had promised. Something had happened on this frozen planet that challenged everything she believed about humans, about strength, and about herself. She just did not know what it meant yet. The return to the Imperium capital was complicated by the fact that Vex'ahlia refused to execute Marcus, as tradition demanded. She declared him her war prize, a living trophy to be kept in the palace as a reminder of the battle. The council members exchanged worried glances but said nothing. A queen's war prizes were her own business, even if keeping a human alive seemed eccentric at best. Marcus was given quarters in the palace's east wing, rooms that had once housed visiting dignitaries from other dragon worlds. The space was enormous by human standards, with ceilings that soared 30 meters high and furniture scaled for beings 10 times his size. Guards were posted outside his door, though whether they were there to keep him in or keep others out, he could not be certain. Vex'ahlia threw herself into her royal duties with renewed energy, trying to distract herself from confusing thoughts. She presided over trade negotiations, settled territorial disputes, and approved new military campaigns. But at night she found herself wandering to the East Wing, ostensibly to check on her prisoner but really just to talk. They would sit in the palace gardens under 3 moons and continue the conversations they had started on the ice planet. 3 months after their return, Vex'ahlia began experiencing unusual symptoms: fatigue that was uncommon for dragons, sensitivity to certain smells, and a strange restlessness. She dismissed it as lingering effects from her injuries, but when the symptoms persisted, she consulted the royal physician, an ancient dragon named Verothix who had served the crown for 8,000 years. The examination results left Verothix speechless for several minutes. Finally, he informed her that she was pregnant. Vex'ahlia immediately said that was impossible. She had not mated with any dragon. Verothix agreed that it should be impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. Moreover, the genetic scans showed something unprecedented. The offspring carried both dragon and human DNA. Vex'ahlia felt her world tilt. She remembered the storm on the ice planet, the 3 days wrapped around Marcus to keep him alive. Dragons had latent shape-shifting abilities coded deep in their genetics, remnants from ancient evolutionary adaptations. The prolonged intimate contact, combined with her weakened state and his desperate need, must have triggered something. Her body had adapted, bridged an impossible genetic gap, and created life. She swore Verothix to absolute secrecy and tried to think. Dragon pregnancies lasted 2 full years and could not be hidden from the court. Her body would change, and eventually everyone would know. She faced choices that all seemed terrible. Terminating the pregnancy went against every dragon instinct to protect their young. Revealing the truth meant execution for species contamination. Fleeing meant abandoning her people and her throne. For 2 weeks she told no one, not even Marcus. She grew increasingly withdrawn, snapping at advisors and avoiding council meetings. Lord Cremaxis approached her with concern, suggesting that perhaps she needed more time to recover from her ordeal. She nearly burned him for his presumption. Marcus noticed the change immediately. When he asked if something was wrong, she almost told him. Instead, she ordered him confined to his quarters and refused to see him. That lasted 3 days before she realized she was being a coward. Whatever she decided, he deserved to know the truth. She went to his quarters late at night when the palace was quiet. She dismissed the guards and entered alone. Marcus was sitting by the window, reading from a human datapad he had somehow acquired. He looked up and immediately knew something serious was happening. She told him everything. Marcus's reaction was not what she expected. He did not recoil in horror or revulsion. Instead, he asked if she was all right if the pregnancy was endangering her health. When she said she was physically fine, he nodded slowly and said they would figure it out together. His acceptance, his immediate concern for her well-being rather than the impossibility of the situation, broke something inside her. She found herself crying, something dragons rarely did, and he held her hand while she processed emotions she had never experienced before. They talked through the night, examining every option. Finally, they developed a plan. It was risky and required perfect timing, but it might work. Vex'ahlia would claim the pregnancy was a deliberate experiment. She would say she initiated it to prove that human genetics offered nothing of value to dragons. The offspring would be weak, malformed, evidence that mixing species was a dead end. It would explain her contact with Marcus and give political cover until the children were born. 2 days later, Lord Mordax the Adamant requested an emergency council session. He was a powerful dragon who had long coveted the throne, and his silver-black scales seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He stood before the assembled nobility and revealed that he had proof of Vex'ahlia's condition. His spies had intercepted medical reports. The queen was carrying hybrid offspring, an abomination that violated the fundamental laws of their civilization. The chamber erupted into chaos. Dragons roared accusations and denials. Some demanded Vex'ahlia's immediate execution. Others insisted there must be some mistake. Through it all, Vex'ahlia remained perfectly calm on her throne, waiting for the noise to die down. When silence finally returned, she spoke with absolute authority. She confirmed that yes, she was pregnant. Yes, the father was the human prisoner. And yes, she had done it deliberately. The entire council stared at her in shock. She explained that during her time on the ice planet, she had observed human adaptability firsthand. She decided to test whether this trait could be incorporated into dragon genetics through breeding. Of course, she expected the experiment to fail. The offspring would likely be weak, possibly not even viable. But science required testing hypotheses, and she was willing to carry the pregnancy to term to gather data. It was a masterful performance. She presented the situation as cold scientific inquiry rather than emotional connection. Several council members who had been calling for her execution moments before now nodded thoughtfully. Dragons valued knowledge, and if this was research, well, perhaps it had merit. Mordax was not convinced. He argued that even if her intentions were scientific, the act itself was degrading to their species. A queen should not lower herself to such experiments. Others should handle this sort of work, if it was truly necessary. Vex'ahlia countered that a queen led by example. If the research had value, she would not ask others to do what she was unwilling to do herself. The debate raged for hours. Finally, a vote was called. The council agreed to allow the pregnancy to continue as an official research project, monitored by royal physicians. When the offspring were born, they would be studied extensively. If they showed promise, the research might continue. If they were weak or deformed as expected, the entire matter would be closed and never spoken of again. Vex'ahlia had won a temporary victory, but she knew the real test would come at birth. If the children showed any unusual strength or abilities, the council would see them as threats rather than scientific curiosities. She would have to be very careful about what information the physicians reported. Over the following months, she continued ruling while her body changed in ways that made the physicians increasingly nervous. Dragon pregnancies were well understood, but this was different. The genetic scans showed impossible combinations. The fetuses were developing structures that existed in neither parent species. Verothix privately warned her that the birth itself might kill her. As her body was not designed for live birth, Marcus became her constant companion, though they maintained the fiction that he was merely a research subject. He read everything he could find about human pregnancy and childbirth, trying to prepare for what was coming. He made her laugh with stories about human fathers panicking in delivery rooms. He held her claw when the pain grew bad during the later months. In the final weeks before the birth, Mordax made one last attempt to stop the process. He published a manifesto arguing that hybrid offspring represented an existential threat to dragon purity. Some younger dragons rallied to his cause, forming a faction that called themselves the Purists. They wore silver armbands and declared that only pure-blooded dragons should be allowed to hold positions of power. Vex'ahlia watched the growing movement with concern. Mordax was using her pregnancy to gain political power, positioning himself as the defender of tradition. If he gathered enough support, he might attempt a coup. The birth of her children could very well trigger a civil war, but it was too late to stop now. Her body was committed to the pregnancy, and the children were coming whether the Imperium was ready or not. As she felt the first contractions begin 2 years after that storm on the ice planet, Vex'ahlia realized that everything was about to change. Her children would be born into a world divided over their very existence. She could only hope that when everyone saw them, they would understand that some changes were not threats but opportunities. The birth was about to begin, and with it, the fate of the Imperium would be decided. The labor began at dawn on the day of the solar eclipse, which some took as an omen, though no one could agree if it was good or bad. Vex'ahlia had retreated to the royal birthing chamber, a massive room lined with heat-resistant stone and equipped with medical equipment that looked more like torture devices to human eyes. Ferothix and his team of physicians prepared frantically, consulting ancient texts and modern scanners in equal measure. No one knew exactly what to expect. Dragons laid eggs. That was how their biology worked, had always worked, for millions of years of evolution. But the scans clearly showed that these offspring were developing like mammalian young, not forming shells but growing in fluid sacs connected directly to Vex'ahlia's body. She would have to give birth the way humans did, and her body was not designed for it. The pain began as a dull pressure and escalated into something that made Vex'ahlia roar with an intensity that shook the palace walls. In the courtyard outside, lesser dragons looked up in alarm. Their queen was suffering, and they were powerless to help. Marcus insisted on being present despite Ferothix's protests that humans had no place in a dragon medical procedure. Vex'ahlia overruled him. If she was going to die, she wanted Marcus there. The first day was agony. Contractions came in waves that felt like her body was tearing itself apart from the inside. Dragon births were supposed to be quick, efficient processes. Eggs were laid over a few hours, then incubated for months. This was completely different. Her body was fighting against its own nature, trying to accomplish something it had never been designed to do. Marcus stayed by her side through all of it. When she thrashed in pain, her tail sweeping across the chamber and destroying medical equipment, he dodged and returned. When her claws extended involuntarily and gouged deep cuts in his arms and shoulders, he barely flinched. He spoke to her constantly, telling her stories, reminding her to breathe, being a presence of calm in the chaos of pain. On the second day, complications developed. Ferothix informed her that one of the infants was positioned incorrectly, putting pressure on her internal organs in ways that could prove fatal. They would need to turn the child manually, which would be excruciating. Vex'ahlia told them to do whatever was necessary. She had not come this far to give up now. The procedure took 4 hours and left her screaming until her voice went hoarse. Marcus held her foreclaw through all of it, his hands bleeding from where her grip had crushed through his gloves and into skin. When it was finally done, Ferothix looked exhausted and announced that they had successfully repositioned the infant. Now they just had to wait for her body to complete the process. On the third day, the actual birth began. Vex'ahlia had faced enemies in battle, survived impossible situations, ruled an empire through force of will, but nothing had prepared her for this. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to make the pain end by any means necessary, but beneath that was a deeper instinct. Protect the young, no matter the cost. Protect the young. The first child emerged just after noon. It was a boy, and the sight of him made every physician in the room fall silent. He was not malformed. He was not weak. He was perfect in a way that defied explanation. His body was primarily human in shape and proportion, but scales ran along his spine and forearms, gleaming like his mother's platinum coloring. His eyes opened immediately, revealing draconic pupils that glowed with inner fire. As Ferothix cleaned him and wrapped him in specially prepared cloth, the infant opened his mouth and released a small burst of flame. Marcus stared at his son with an expression of wonder, mixed with terror. This child was hours old and already demonstrating abilities that neither parent possessed at birth. What would he become as he grew? The second child, a girl, came an hour later. She appeared more draconic than her brother, with a humanoid frame but covered in fine scales that shifted colors in the light. Small wings, not yet fully developed, extended from her back. Her face was a blend of dragon and human features, beautiful in an otherworldly way. But the most shocking thing happened when Verothix placed her on Vexalia's chest. The infant looked up at her mother and spoke a single word in perfect Draconic. "Mother." The room fell into stunned silence. Dragons did not speak at birth. They developed language slowly over their first decade. Humans babbled for years before forming words. This child had spoken clearly and with obvious understanding within minutes of taking her first breath. Vexalia held both her children and felt emotions she had never experienced before. Love, fierce and protective, pride in these impossible beings she had created, fear of what would happen when the world learned the truth about them. She named them quickly, before anyone could suggest taking them away for study. The boy would be Kale, meaning fire-bearer in ancient Draconic. The girl would be Lyra, meaning song of change. Marcus was allowed to hold them briefly, and the infants responded to him immediately. Kale grasped his father's finger with surprising strength. Lyra looked at him and said, "Father," with the same eerie perfection she had said, "Mother." Whatever these children were, they were aware and intelligent in ways that frightened even their own parents. Verothix examined them thoroughly while trying to keep his discoveries vague in his official reports. The children could regulate their body temperature like dragons. They could process both human and dragon foods. Their cellular structure was completely unique, showing properties of both species but combined in ways that should not be possible. Most concerning for Verothix was that he detected unusual neural activity, patterns that suggested cognitive abilities far beyond normal infant development. While Vexalia recovered from the traumatic birth, word spread through the palace that the queen's experimental offspring had been born alive and viable. The purist faction led by Mordax demanded to see them. Vexalia refused, citing medical necessity and the infant's fragile condition. In truth, she needed time to understand what her children could do before others discovered their abilities. Over the following days, Kale and Lyra demonstrated more impossible traits. They grew noticeably larger each day, much faster than human or dragon infants. Kale learned to control his flame production, using it to warm himself or communicate displeasure. Lyra began speaking in full sentences, switching between Draconic and the human languages Marcus taught her. At 1 week old, both children understood complex concepts that should have been beyond them for years. Marcus spent every possible moment with his children, teaching them, playing with them, and marveling at what they were becoming. He also noticed something troubling. When the twins were near each other, they seemed to communicate without words. They would look at each other and apparently share thoughts, moving in synchronized ways that suggested a connection deeper than normal sibling bonds. 2 weeks after the birth, while Vexalia was still weak and confined to her chambers, Mordax made his move. He had been gathering supporters, promising them a return to dragon purity and traditional values. In the dead of night, he led an assault on the palace with a force of 300 purist warriors. His target was the royal nursery where the hybrid infants were kept under guard. The palace guards fought bravely, but were outnumbered. Mordax's forces pushed deeper into the palace, heading straight for the east wing. They believed that if they killed the hybrid abominations, they would break Vexalia's spirit and prove that mixing species led only to death and weakness. Marcus heard the sounds of battle and understood immediately what was happening. He grabbed a plasma rifle from a fallen guard and ran toward the nursery. He arrived just as Mordax's assassins broke through the nursery doors. 5 trained dragon warriors against 1 human with a weapon he barely knew how to use. The odds were impossible, but Marcus had learned something important during his months stranded with Vexalia. Impossible did not mean insurmountable. It just meant you had to be creative. He used the palace architecture against his attackers, collapsing doorways and triggering fire suppression systems to confuse them. He fired his weapon not to kill but to distract, buying seconds at a time. When 1 dragon got past his defenses and struck him across the chest with a blow that shattered ribs, he used his own blood to make the floor slippery, causing 2 more attackers to lose their footing. He held them off for 6 minutes before Vexalia's loyal guards finally arrived in force. 6 minutes that left him broken and bleeding but alive. 6 minutes during which his children remained untouched behind him. As he collapsed from blood, loss, the last thing he saw was Vexalia herself, still weak from birth but burning with fury. Tearing through the remaining assassins like they were nothing, the coup attempt was crushed, but Mordax himself escaped. The civil war that Vexalia had feared was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. The Imperium was about to tear itself apart, and at the center of the conflict were two infant twins, who had not asked to be born into a world that saw them as either abominations or threats. As physicians worked frantically to save Marcus's life, Vexalia held her children and realized that the hardest battles were still ahead. Marcus recovered slowly in the medical wing while the Imperium fractured around him. Mordax had fled to the outer territories and declared himself the rightful ruler, claiming that Vexalia had forfeited her crown by creating abominations. Nearly half the Dragon Lord sided with him, either from genuine belief in his cause or from opportunistic calculation that he might win. The other half remained loyal to Vexalia, though some did so reluctantly, uncomfortable with her hybrid offspring but unwilling to support a coup. War fleets assembled on both sides. Planets declared allegiance to one faction or the other. Trade routes collapsed as ships refused to travel through disputed territory. The Imperium, which had stood united for 50,000 years, was tearing itself apart. And at the heart of the conflict were two infants who were now 3 months old and already demonstrating abilities that terrified and amazed in equal measure. Vexalia called an emergency session of her loyal council. She was done with half-truths and political maneuvering. If she was going to win this war, she needed her supporters to understand the truth. She brought Kale and Lyra before the assembled dragons, along with Marcus, who still walked with a limp from his injuries. The chamber filled with shocked murmurs as the twins were revealed. Kale, now the size of a human toddler despite being only months old, demonstrated his ability to shift between forms. His human appearance could transform, scales spreading to cover his body, his size increasing, taking on a more draconic aspect. Then he would shift back, perfectly controlled. Lyra showed her own gift, speaking in 5 different languages while simultaneously manipulating a small flame that danced between her fingers with precision no adult dragon could match. But the truly shocking demonstration came when Vexalia asked them to show the council their most unusual ability. Kale and Lyra looked at each other, and then every dragon in the room suddenly felt their presence inside their minds. Not invasive or hostile, just a gentle touch of awareness. The twins could share thoughts, not just with each other, but with any being nearby if they chose. It was telepathy of a sort that neither species possessed alone. Vexalia let the implications sink in before she spoke. She told them the truth about the pregnancy, about the storm on the ice planet and the connection formed in desperation and need. She admitted that the children were not an experiment, but the result of something she had not planned and still did not fully understand. But she asked them to look past the circumstances and see what Kale and Lyra represented. Dragon civilization had not changed in millennia. They were powerful, advanced, immortal, but stagnant. Humans were weak and short-lived, but they evolved constantly, adapting and innovating. Her children combined dragon permanence with human adaptability. They could survive in environments that would kill either parent species. They learned at incredible speeds. They possessed abilities that neither dragon nor human had alone. She asked the council a simple question. What was more valuable to the Imperium's future? Maintaining absolute purity while slowly becoming obsolete? Or embracing change that could make them stronger than they had ever been? Lord Cremaxis, one of her oldest supporters, rose to speak. He admitted that he had been uncomfortable with the twins at first, viewing them as violations of natural order. But he had watched the palace security footage of Marcus defending the nursery, a single human holding off 5 dragon warriors through nothing but determination and clever thinking. That was not weakness. That was a different kind of strength. Perhaps, he suggested, strength came in more forms than dragons had previously acknowledged. Other council members voiced their support, though some remained silent and troubled. The vote was called, and the result was clear. Those who remained loyal to Vexalia would support her fully, including accepting the twins as legitimate heirs to the throne. It was a radical shift, but they had already chosen her side in the war. There was no point in half measures now. Mordax learned of the Council's decision and responded by accelerating his military campaign. His fleet attacked 3 loyal worlds, bombing them from orbit until they surrendered. He declared that any territory harboring hybrid sympathizers would be purged. The war turned brutal with terrifying speed. Vex'ahlia led her own forces in response, but she fought differently than she had before her time with Marcus. Instead of overwhelming force and direct assaults, she used strategy and misdirection. She allied with human colonies that Mordax had dismissed as irrelevant, gaining access to their tactics and technology. She offered genuine partnership rather than domination. And humans responded by supporting her cause enthusiastically. The turning point came during the siege of Crystal Spire, the Imperium's second-largest military shipyard. Mordax's fleet surrounded the facility, preparing for a final assault that would cripple Vex'ahlia's ability to build new warships. The defensive fleet was outnumbered 3-1 and defeat seemed certain. But Vex'ahlia had a secret weapon, and it was not military might. Human engineers and technicians had been working throughout the Imperium as labor and maintenance crews for decades. They were invisible to most dragons, considered too insignificant to watch carefully. Now thousands of them activated simultaneously. They sabotaged weapon systems, disrupted communications, and even depressurized sections of Mordax's ships. The dragon crews panicked as their vessels failed around them, not from external attack but from internal collapse. While Mordax's fleet struggled with cascading system failures, Vex'ahlia's forces struck hard and fast. The battle was over in hours, with Mordax losing nearly half his fleet. It was a devastating blow to the purist cause, and it demonstrated something important. Power alone was not enough to win wars. You also needed intelligence, adaptability, and the willingness to accept help from unexpected sources. The final confrontation came 6 months after the war began. Mordax made one desperate assault on the capital planet itself, bringing every remaining ship under his command. He challenged Vex'ahlia to single combat, as dragon tradition demanded. If he won, his supporters would rally and the war would continue. If he lost, the purist cause would collapse. Vex'ahlia accepted, though she was still not fully recovered from the traumatic birth and months of war. They met on a designated battlefield, a scorched plain where ancient dragon kings had once settled their disputes. Thousands watched from ships overhead, waiting to see which vision of the future would prevail. Mordax was larger than Vex'ahlia and had not been injured recently. He fought with traditional dragon tactics, relying on strength, fire, and aerial superiority. Vex'ahlia fought the way Marcus had taught her to think. She used the terrain, forcing Mordax to fight in narrow canyons where his size was a disadvantage. She feinted and misdirected, making him waste energy on attacks that hit nothing. She used his own aggression against him, letting him tire himself while she conserved strength. The battle lasted 3 hours, far longer than most dragon duels. Finally, Vex'ahlia saw her opening. Mordax committed to a full power dive, intending to end the fight with overwhelming force. At the last second, she rolled aside and struck upward with her tail, hitting him precisely in the wing joint. The blow shattered bones and sent him crashing to the ground. Before he could recover, she was on him, jaws at his throat. Tradition said she should kill him, but Vex'ahlia had learned that tradition was not always wise. She offered him mercy and exile instead of death. Mordax, humiliated and defeated, accepted. His supporters surrendered shortly after, and the civil war ended. The years that followed brought transformation to the Imperium that would have been unthinkable before. Vex'ahlia opened negotiations with human governments, establishing genuine alliances rather than domination. Dragon and human engineers began working together, combining their respective strengths to create technology neither could have developed alone. Culture flowed both ways, with dragons learning human art forms and humans studying dragon philosophy. Kyle and Lyra grew into remarkable young people. At 10 years old, they were already as capable as adult dragons in many ways, but with a flexibility of thought that came from their human heritage. They attended both dragon academies and human universities, becoming bridges between the two civilizations. Other dragons began cautiously exploring relationships with humans, and while hybrid offspring remained rare, they were no longer seen as abominations but as symbols of cooperation. Marcus became the first human ambassador consort, a position that made some traditionalist dragons uncomfortable, but which earned respect through his wisdom and dedication. He and Vex'ahlia ruled together in practice, if not in title, demonstrating that partnership could be stronger than domination. 10 years after the twins' birth, Vexalia stood on a balcony overlooking a joint colony world, where dragons and humans built cities together. She watched as Kale and Lyra practiced flying over the settlement, their laughter carrying on the wind. Below, dragon and human children played together in streets that neither species could have built alone. She thought back to that day in the council chamber, when she had ridiculed the idea of breeding with humans. She had been so certain of dragon superiority, so convinced that strength meant power and size. She had nearly lost everything because of that arrogance. The ice planet had taught her that survival required adaptation. The birth of her